It was a brisk autumn morning when Judge Samuel Richardson stepped into his courtroom prepared to tackle another day of mundane cases. The cold air from the early morning mist lingered in the halls of the courthouse as the sound of heels tapping against the marble floors echoed in the empty corridors. The judge's robes swayed slightly as he walked past the rows of empty chairs. Before the case files were brought to him, there was the hum of lawyers murmuring and defendants sitting nervously in their seats. He felt the weight of the day ahead, but as usual, he was unfazed. The routine of court was something that calmed him, a rhythm he had come to understand after years on the bench. He'd seen all types of cases, from the most trivial misdemeanors to complex criminal trials. Today, he expected nothing more than the usual flow of traffic violations and minor infractions. It was the kind of day when nothing extraordinary was expected. Judge Richardson had been on the bench for nearly 2 decades. His reputation for fairness was well known. He prided himself on treating every case the same, no matter who stood before him in the courtroom. No one was above the law, not the rich, not the powerful, not even the famous. Every defendant was equal in his eyes. Every case deserved the same careful scrutiny and the same impartial decision. But on that day, the courtroom would be more than just a stage for justice to play out. It would be the setting for a meeting that neither the judge nor the woman standing before him would ever forget. Laura Winters stepped into the courtroom as the bailiff called her name. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor as she walked toward the defendant's table. She was in her late 30s, her brown hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her expression calm, though her fingers fidgeted with a pen she held in her hand. Laura had dealt with plenty of challenges before, but standing in front of a judge for a speeding ticket made her feel oddly nervous. She glanced down at the paperwork before her and tried to focus on the task at hand. This wasn't the kind of meeting she'd been preparing for, but it was part of life, even for someone like her. She didn't make a habit of speeding, but today was different. She had been late to a vital meeting and had been pushing the speed limit more than she should have. There was no excuse for it, but she couldn't deny it. Judge Richardson looked up from his desk, his eyes scanning the paperwork before him. He wasn't immediately taken by her appearance. She was just another defendant in a long line of traffic violators he had to handle that day. Her case seemed straightforward enough: speeding violation, the fine was routine, and the ruling was clear. He listened intently as Laura spoke, explaining her situation with the same calm tone she had used in the waiting room. There was no attempt to deflect or argue. She was simply there to accept the consequence of her actions. The judge made his decision quickly, without hesitation. The fine was significant but fair. It was the kind of fine that would make anyone think twice about speeding again. As he handed down the ruling, he gave Laura a brief look. She seemed unfazed by the penalty, perhaps even resigned to it. She paid the fine and left the courtroom with a polite nod to the judge. As she exited the door, Judge Richardson moved on to the next case. He didn't think much about her after that day. She was just another person he had to make a decision about, but in the quiet of the courthouse, her face lingered in his mind for a fleeting moment, and he didn't know why yet. Weeks passed since the brief encounter between Judge Samuel Richardson and Laura Winters, yet the incident lingered in his mind like a distant echo. His daily routine of presiding over cases and making decisions, often without a second thought, had resumed. But as much as he tried to push the memory of Laura Winters aside, there was something about that moment that stuck with him. It wasn't the fine itself or the words exchanged in the courtroom. It was something else, an almost intangible feeling that nudged at his subconscious. Laura, on the other hand, moved forward with her life as well. Her role in the political world demanded her attention, and she hardly had the time to reflect on her court appearance. The speeding ticket had been a minor inconvenience in her otherwise busy schedule. She had been late for a conference call and didn't notice how fast she was going until the flashing lights of the police car behind her reminded her. The officer had been polite, giving her a warning before issuing the ticket. She had no complaints, and in her mind, it was simply an unfortunate part of life. The fine, however, was a different matter. She had been aware of the amount when she first saw the paper, but at the time, she hadn't given it much thought. It wasn't until the payment notice arrived a few days later that she remembered the weight of the decision made in that small courtroom. A heavy fine for a minor infraction seemed harsh, especially when compared to the more lenient treatment many people in her position received. Laura was no stranger to the preferential treatment that often accompanied her position as a member of Congress, and she had always been careful to avoid it. But still, something about the fine felt off. Despite the nagging thought in the back of her mind, Laura paid the fine without much fanfare. She didn't want to make waves or attract attention to what she considered a simple mistake. However, she couldn't ignore the fleeting thought that perhaps Judge Richardson's decision had been driven by something more than the law. She had always prided herself on being just another citizen, one who followed the rules like everyone else. But that wasn't always how the world saw her, and perhaps it wasn't how Judge Richardson saw her either. In the weeks that followed, word began to spread quietly around the courthouse. Laura's face seemed to pop up here and there in conversations between clerks and lawyers. A few men recognized her immediately, but most dismissed her as just another person who had crossed their path. It wasn't until one of the more seasoned court clerks mentioned her name in passing, "Isn't she the one who works in Washington?" that the pieces started falling into place. Judge Richardson had heard the whispers too. The name Laura Winters rang a bell, but it wasn't until he overheard a conversation in the courthouse lobby that the full scope of the situation hit him. "She's a congresswoman," one of the clerks had remarked casually. "Represents the district. Big deal in D.C." Judge Richardson's face drained of color as realization struck him like a ton of bricks. The woman he had fined, who had walked into his courtroom so unassuming and polite, wasn't just another defendant. She was a powerful political figure, a member of Congress, someone with influence and sway. How had he missed it? He had treated her as just another person in the courtroom, no different from anyone else. But now, with the clarity of recognition, he couldn't help but feel the sting of doubt creeping in. Had he made the right call? Had he overstepped? For a moment, Judge Richardson was unsure of what to think. There was no doubt in his mind that Laura Winters had acted like any other citizen, and he had acted according to the law. But now, the weight of the situation felt entirely different. This was no longer just about a speeding ticket. It was about fairness, power, and the ever-present questions that arose when politics and justice intersected. Would it have been different if he had known who she was? Would his decision have changed? And if it had, would it still have been fair? The questions hung in the air like an unfinished thought, and Judge Richardson could not shake them. As Judge Samuel Richardson sat at his desk that afternoon, his mind wandered back to the case he had handled weeks ago, the seemingly routine speeding violation involving Laura Winters. Now that he knew who she truly was, his thoughts about the whole encounter had taken a turn. What had felt like just another minor infraction now seemed more layered, more significant, and he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something had been missed. The moment he had realized Laura Winters was a congresswoman, his professional world had tilted. He had been unaware of the woman's true identity, and now he couldn't help but wonder if his ruling had been fair or if it had been too harsh. It was strange how things sometimes fell into place. He had done his job as he always had, treating every case the same regardless of who stood in front of him. But now there was a sense of discomfort in knowing that this particular defendant, whom he had dealt with so impersonally, wielded influence far beyond the walls of his courtroom. It was a paradox. He had treated her like anyone else, and yet, in his mind, he couldn't help but feel that the very nature of her identity should have altered the way he handled her case. Meanwhile, Laura Winters had already moved on from the incident. Her life, full of political engagements and personal commitments, had not left much room for reflection on a simple speeding ticket. To her, it was a small blip in an otherwise bustling schedule. Still, the fine had bothered her more than she initially admitted. She had wondered if there had been a hidden message in the penalty, some unspoken implication. She had grown accustomed to the way the world viewed her, always under a microscope, her every action scrutinized through the lens of her public life. But she had never expected to feel this kind of distance from the law, a distance that wasn't just a result of her position, but perhaps because of how the world had come to see her. She had been raised with the belief that no one was above the law, not even her. But now, seeing how the world had suddenly shifted the moment she entered that courtroom, she felt that invisible line between everyday citizen and public figure had never been clearer. People looked at her differently now, not just as Laura Winters, the woman, but as a congresswoman, an embodiment of power and influence. She was both proud of that role and weary of it. But the real twist came when, weeks later, Laura's colleagues at the Capitol started to whisper, "I heard you were fined by Judge Richardson." One of them had remarked casually in passing, as if it were some kind of badge of honor. Laura, ever composed, simply nodded, not wanting to entertain the topic more than necessary. It was a brief moment, a fleeting conversation, but the whispers began to spread, and suddenly the story was everywhere. Politicians, journalists, and even staffers talking about the fine issued to a sitting congresswoman, as though it were some kind of political drama unfolding in real time. Laura did her best to ignore it. To her, the fine had been a minor inconvenience, but the reality was that it wasn't just about the fine anymore. The media frenzy that followed, coupled with the subtle but intense conversations in the halls of Congress, made it clear. This incident was bigger than she had anticipated. Back at the courthouse, the clerks and bailiffs began to piece together the puzzle. Judge Richardson's staff, who had not made the connection at the time, were now in shock at what they had missed. A simple speeding ticket had been handled like any other violation, but Laura Winters, the congresswoman, was no ordinary citizen. Her face had appeared on news outlets, her name circulating in every political conversation. The whispers in the courthouse turned to speculations. Was it a mistake to treat her just like any other defendant? Or had Judge Richardson been right to treat her equally? The question lingered in the air like an unspoken tension, but neither Judge Richardson nor Laura Winters could afford to dwell on it for long. The world continued to turn, and their paths, though intertwined by this one brief encounter, were soon to cross again in a way neither could have predicted. It wasn't long before Judge Samuel Richardson's realization about Laura Winters' true identity began to settle into a quiet unease. He couldn't stop replaying the moment in his mind, the moment he had handed down that fine with such unflinching impartiality. He had seen hundreds of defendants pass through his courtroom, each case treated with the same cold efficiency. But now, knowing that Laura Winters was a member of Congress, his actions seemed almost mechanical, too impersonal for someone of such stature. Had he misjudged the situation? Was he too harsh in his ruling? It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about what that fine represented in a broader context. Judge Richardson had spent his career believing that the law was the great equalizer, that it didn't matter who you were, where you came from, or what you had done before. In his eyes, everyone deserved the same treatment. But with the new information about Laura's identity, he began questioning whether that belief was truly bulletproof. Had he inadvertently sent a message of indifference to a person who could have used a little more understanding, given the pressures of her public position? He wondered if, perhaps, he had allowed the weight of the law to overshadow the nuance of the situation. Meanwhile, Laura Winters, who had been focusing on the whirlwind of her professional life, couldn't ignore the growing discomfort surrounding her speeding ticket. It wasn't the fine itself, it was how the world had reacted to it. As a congresswoman, every action was magnified, dissected, and discussed. People who had never met her were now offering opinions on her case, as if they had been present in that courtroom. They speculated about whether the fine was appropriate, whether Judge Richardson had been too harsh, or whether he had treated her differently because of who she was. At first, Laura was indifferent. She paid the fine and moved on, believing that the issue would fade into the background like so many other minor inconveniences. But the longer it lingered, the more she realized how little control she had over how people perceived the situation. It wasn't just about the fine. It was about the perception of power and how people viewed her, not as a person, but as a symbol of something greater. She couldn't help but wonder if Judge Richardson had been influenced by her status, even though he had claimed to treat her like any other citizen. Did his decision reflect his personal belief in fairness, or did it reveal an unintentional bias that she and the public were yet to fully grasp? The story started to snowball in ways both Laura and Judge Richardson couldn't have predicted. A few days after hearing about the media buzz, Judge Richardson attended a local event. a dinner celebrating public service. He had reluctantly agreed to attend, hoping to shake off the unease he felt about the speeding ticket case. As he entered the event hall, shaking hands with familiar faces, his eyes scanned the crowd. He saw politicians, local figures, and civic leaders chatting amongst themselves. And then, amidst the chatter, he saw her. Laura Winters. She was standing across the room, holding court with a group of colleagues. The moment their eyes met, time seemed to stretch for an instant. The awkwardness was palpable. Laura, who had been both admired and scrutinized by so many, seemed perfectly at ease in the crowd. But for Judge Richardson, that moment was loaded with tension. He had recognized her as soon as she walked into the room, and now, knowing who she was, his role in the courtroom felt like a distant memory. As the evening unfolded, fate had a peculiar way of weaving their paths together again. Laura walked toward him with a confident smile. "Judge Richardson," she greeted him warmly, "I didn't expect to see you here." Judge Richardson, caught off guard by the calmness in her voice, fumbled for words. "Congresswoman Winters, I didn't expect to see you either." He chuckled nervously, trying to brush away the awkwardness, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was not going to be a simple, cordial conversation. In the back of his mind, he could already feel the weight of the conversation that was about to unfold. He had been unaware of her true identity when they met in court, and now, standing before her again, the situation felt much more complicated. The fine, the ruling, the treatment, it all felt different in this new context. He wanted to apologize, but he wasn't sure how to approach it. He could feel the eyes of the other guests subtly watching them, waiting for something to happen. Laura's smile remained steady. "I guess you didn't recognize me in the courtroom," she said lightly, her tone playful. "I'm not usually in front of a judge." Judge Richardson's stomach twisted. "I didn't," he admitted, his voice low. "I didn't realize who you were at the time." A faint smile tugged at Laura's lips. "I figured as much," she said. "But I've had to hand it to you, Judge. You treated me like anyone else, and I appreciate that." Her words were disarming. For a moment, the judge wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or embarrassed. He had always believed in treating everyone equally, but now, knowing the person he had fined was sitting before him, his sense of pride in his impartiality seemed more complicated than it ever had before. As the conversation between Judge Richardson and Laura Winters continued, the weight of unspoken words hung in the air. Though their exchange had started off civil and polite, there was an undeniable undercurrent of tension between them. Laura's calm demeanor belied the complexity of her emotions, and the judge could sense it. She had every right to be offended, to feel that she was being unfairly treated. After all, her speeding ticket had become a public spectacle, and yet her composure seemed to challenge any such assumption. Judge Richardson shifted awkwardly, unsure of how to proceed. There was so much left unsaid, but he wasn't sure if now was the time to address it. He had never imagined that his routine work would somehow cross paths with the world of politics in such a personal way. The fine he had issued to Laura Winters had, against all odds, become a focal point of public discussion. To the world, it was just a speeding ticket, but to him, it had come to symbolize the blurred lines between justice and power. Laura, for her part, was grappling with her own thoughts. She wasn't angry at the judge, not really, but there was a lingering sense of discomfort. She had always tried to keep her public and private lives separate, and this incident felt like a disruption to that balance. In her position, she was no stranger to scrutiny, but she had expected the law to be a sanctuary, a place where everyone was treated the same, no matter their status. The fact that Judge Richardson had treated her as any other defendant was both reassuring and troubling. It confirmed the integrity of the judicial system, but also left her feeling exposed in a way she wasn't used to. "I appreciate your honesty, Judge," Laura finally said, breaking the silence. "Most people would have tried to avoid the topic, sweep it under the rug, but you didn't." Judge Richardson nodded, his mind racing. He knew that she was right. It would have been easier to act as though nothing had happened, to pretend their brief encounter in the courtroom hadn't left an impression. But he couldn't ignore the complexities of the situation anymore. "I'm not sure what else I could have done. I followed the law the way I always do, he said, his voice steady but with an edge of uncertainty creeping in. Laura smiled, though it was a touch bittersweet. And that's what I respect about you, Judge. You didn't let anything influence your decision, even when you could have. But she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. It's harder when you're in the public eye. Every small action is analyzed, and sometimes it feels like people forget that we're human. We all make mistakes, no matter what role we're in. Judge Richardson met her gaze, his expression softening. I understand, he said quietly, the weight of her words sinking in. It's easy to forget that sometimes. In my court, I try to treat everyone the same, but I never truly understood the weight of what being a public figure carries. I couldn't have known. There was a pause between them, a moment of quiet reflection. The world outside the dinner hall continued to bustle with conversations and laughter, but for them, it felt like time had slowed down. In this space, amidst the quiet hum of people and glasses clinking in the background, they both found themselves in an unexpected moment of mutual understanding. Laura finally broke the silence again, her voice now more serious. I know that you did what you thought was right, Judge, and I don't think anyone else could have done it differently. But sometimes when you're in a position like mine, even the smallest thing becomes a spectacle, and you can't just ignore how it affects everything around you. Judge Richardson could see that her words were more than just an explanation. They were an admission of the pressures she faced every day. The political world wasn't just about making decisions in front of voters. It was about living under a constant microscope, one where every action was scrutinized, every choice analyzed. For Laura, a simple speeding ticket had become a symbol of the growing tension between her private self and her public persona. I understand now, the judge said softly. I never realized the burden that comes with public life. It's something I hadn't considered, and I should have. I'm sorry if my ruling added to that pressure. Laura nodded, appreciating his sincerity. Thank you, Judge, she said, her voice a little softer now. It means a lot to hear that from you. Just then, one of the event organizers approached them, pulling them back into the swirl of conversations happening around them. Laura and Judge Richardson exchanged a brief but meaningful glance, the unspoken understanding between them now a quiet but undeniable bond. As the night wore on, both of them continued to mingle with the crowd, but their encounter lingered in their thoughts. For Laura, it had been an unexpected moment of clarity, a reminder that even the smallest interactions, like a speeding ticket, could have ripple effects in ways they couldn't predict. For Judge Richardson, it was a moment of reflection, a reminder that justice wasn't just about the law. It was about understanding the context behind the law, about recognizing the people behind the cases, and sometimes about acknowledging the invisible weight of power in public life. They may have come from different worlds, but in that brief exchange, they had found common ground. The conversation at the event marked a turning point for both Judge Samuel Richardson and Laura Winters. While they hadn't solved the complex layers of their individual lives and careers, they had at least taken the first step toward understanding each other's perspectives. For the judge, it was a reminder of how powerful even the smallest actions could be, how a decision made in a courtroom could spiral into something far greater than intended. For Laura, it was a moment of reassurance that some people still saw her as a person first, beyond her title or her public role. The following weeks, however, would bring unexpected consequences for both of them. What had started as a simple speeding violation had become a symbol of something bigger, a reminder of the complexities that come with power, influence, and fairness. Laura returned to her life in Washington, but the fine was still a point of conversation. It wasn't just the media anymore. Even some of her colleagues in Congress seemed to have their own opinions about how the situation had been handled. Did you really get fined like any other citizen? One of her fellow Congress members asked her one day during a meeting. No special treatment. You just paid it. Laura, though used to these types of questions, was surprised by how often it came up. Yes, she replied, her voice calm but tinged with frustration. I paid it because it was my responsibility, and I'm not above the law. I don't think I should be treated differently just because of my position. But there was more to it than that. As much as she tried to convince herself that it was just another bureaucratic inconvenience, she couldn't shake the feeling that her case had become a litmus test, a way for the media and others to measure her integrity. She wasn't sure if they were judging her decision to pay the fine or the very fact that she had been fined at all. Her colleagues seemed to take it as an opportunity to question her character, to remind her that she, too, could fall under scrutiny like anyone else. Meanwhile, Judge Richardson found himself facing his own set of consequences. Though his actions had been consistent with the law, he wasn't immune to the whispers that followed the case. At first, it was subtle, a few remarks in the courthouse hallways, a couple of jokes made in passing about how he had fined a congresswoman. But soon, those whispers grew louder. Some of his colleagues, both on the bench and within the legal community, began questioning whether he had acted too rigidly, too blindly. Had he treated a member of Congress the same way he would treat an ordinary citizen, or had his decision been tainted by his own unawareness of who she was? "Do you ever think you might have been a little too harsh?" one of his fellow judges asked during a break in a judicial conference. "I mean, Congresswoman Winters. You could show some leniency. It's not like she's a regular defendant." Judge Richardson bristled at the implication. "I followed the law," he replied firmly. "The law doesn't change based on who's standing in front of me. It doesn't matter whether it's a congresswoman, a teacher, or a factory worker." The comment, though spoken in the form of a question, left an imprint on him. He had always believed that impartiality was the cornerstone of justice, but now the weight of his decision seemed heavier. He wasn't sure if he regretted his ruling, but the aftermath made him question whether the application of the law had been as clear-cut as he once thought. Could he have considered the broader context without compromising his integrity? Or had he, in his pursuit of impartiality, failed to understand the human side of the equation? For Laura, the weeks following the incident became a continuous balancing act. The speeding fine was no longer just a personal matter, it was a political one. The more people discussed it, the more it became about something larger than her. Was she an example of accountability or a symbol of an unjust system? The media painted the story from every angle, often turning her into the face of something she didn't fully understand. In private moments, she would reflect on her conversation with Judge Richardson. He had been honest and open about his thoughts, and there was a part of her that appreciated his integrity. But in the public sphere, where everything was dissected and magnified, her decision to simply pay the fine became a double-edged sword. For some, she had demonstrated leadership by accepting the consequences of her actions without complaint. To others, she had inadvertently fed the narrative that those in power were immune to the complexities of justice. As the days passed, Laura began to realize that this situation, once a simple, mundane moment in her life, had opened a door to something much larger. She had always been careful about her public image, but now she saw the delicate dance she had to perform in the public eye. It wasn't enough to simply act with integrity. Everything she did would be scrutinized, every choice examined through the lens of her position. She had to walk the line between being an accountable public servant and someone who was above reproach, a line that grew thinner with each passing day. For Judge Richardson, the consequences were equally unsettling. He couldn't ignore the questions that had begun to surface in his own mind. Was impartiality enough, or did understanding the context behind the case matter as well? His decision had been about the letter of the law, but now it felt as if there was more to justice than just the facts presented in the courtroom. The aftermath of the speeding ticket had left both of them questioning what they stood for and how their decisions impacted not just their own lives, but the world around them. It wasn't just a fine anymore, it was a mirror reflecting the complexities of power, justice, and accountability. The weeks that followed continued to be turbulent for both Judge Richardson and Laura Winters. Their individual worlds, which had once been neatly compartmentalized, were now interwoven in ways they couldn't have anticipated. The speeding fine, though seemingly small, had cast long shadows over their careers, forcing them both to examine not only their actions, but also the public's perception of those actions. For Laura, the media frenzy surrounding the fine had only intensified. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues, reporters, and even her own constituents. Everyone seemed to have an opinion. Was it a sign of her accountability, her willingness to follow the rules like everyone else? Or was it a sign of something deeper, something that spoke to the disconnect between the powerful and the ordinary? The coverage, which had initially started as a minor blip, had become a nationwide topic of conversation. Journalists were now probing her decision, asking her if she regretted paying the fine without challenging it. Was she showing humility, or was she inadvertently conceding that those in power were just as vulnerable to the laws they created as anyone else? Laura felt the pressure mounting every day. She had hoped it would blow over, but the more people talked about it, the more she felt as though she were being placed on trial, not for breaking the law, but for the image of what it meant to be in her position. It wasn't enough to just be a responsible citizen. She had to be a symbol of fairness and integrity. But as the days went on, the pressure to be perfect, to be beyond reproach, became suffocating. Late one night, after another round of interviews with the media, Laura sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at the stack of papers in front of her. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, her eyes tired from days of nonstop events. She thought back to the moment she had spoken with Judge Richardson at the dinner. He had been so forthright, so honest. He had acknowledged the complexities of her position, something she hadn't realized she needed to hear. But she also wondered, did his admission of fairness, of trying to treat her like any other defendant, truly capture the bigger picture? Was there more to the law than just impartiality? Meanwhile, Judge Richardson had found himself in a position he never imagined. He had been a respected figure on the bench for years, known for his fairness and adherence to the law. But now, the whispers had grown into louder conversations. His peers, who had once looked up to him as a model of impartiality, were now questioning his judgment. At first, it had been subtle, colleagues wondering aloud if he could have shown more leniency. Some even hinted that perhaps a small act of compassion might have been more appropriate for a congresswoman. One day, Judge Richardson was invited to a meeting with several other members of the judiciary. The conversation started innocently enough, focused on the usual topics of legal reforms and case backlogs. But before long, the subject of Laura Winters and the speeding fine emerged. The comments were less direct than the ones Judge Richardson had heard previously, but the underlying tone was unmistakable. "You know, Samuel," one colleague remarked, "you did what you had to do, of course. But don't you think there's a line between impartiality and inflexibility, especially when it comes to someone in a position like hers?" Another judge nodded. "Yes, it's a tricky situation. She was just trying to do what was right, and the law's not always so black and white. Perhaps a little more flexibility could have gone a long way in this case." Judge Richardson felt his chest tighten. He had spent his career ensuring fairness, but now he found himself at the center of a moral dilemma. Had he been too rigid in his decision? Or was it the system that needed to change? Was it that, in his blind adherence to impartiality, he had failed to account for the nuances that came with certain situations? Later that evening, in the privacy of his home, Judge Richardson found himself contemplating the question of leniency. Could he have exercised more compassion? Was it wrong for him to treat Laura Winters the same as he would a regular defendant? The idea unsettled him, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if his steadfast belief in the law was enough. He couldn't help but wonder, had he missed something important in his pursuit of justice? For both of them, the fallout from the fine was taking a toll. Laura was exhausted, mentally and emotionally. The pressure of being a congresswoman had always been heavy, but now it felt like the world was watching her every move. The fine, which had initially seemed like a small blip in her otherwise busy life, had become a reflection of her worth, her character, and the way she'd balanced public service with personal responsibility. She spent more time than she cared to admit worrying about her image, how every action might be misinterpreted, how every decision could turn into a headline. She thought about Judge Richardson often. Despite the differences in their roles, they shared something in common now, an understanding of how the smallest decisions could grow into something far more complicated than they ever imagined. But as the days dragged on, Laura began to realize something crucial. She couldn't control how the world viewed her, nor could she control the opinions of others. What mattered was that she had made the right choice for herself, one based on her principles. Whether the public believed it or not, she knew what she had done, and for better or worse, she would have to live with that decision. Judge Richardson, too, would face his own reckoning. The decision he had made, though based on his years of experience and commitment to the law, would not be easy to shake. The fine had, in many ways, forced him to confront the complexities of his role. And in the silence that followed, he came to a realization. Justice wasn't just about blind impartiality. It was about understanding, empathy, and sometimes finding the courage to balance both. The months that followed brought a quieter sort of resolution for both Judge Richardson and Laura Winters. The media frenzy surrounding the speeding fine had gradually faded, replaced by newer headlines and political scandals. But for both of them, the echoes of that brief moment in time lingered, continuing to shape their actions and decisions in ways they hadn't anticipated. Laura's life eventually returned to its usual hectic pace. The constant scrutiny from the media and her colleagues didn't completely disappear, but she learned to manage it. She had always been passionate about her work in Congress, fighting for policies that made a difference, but now there was an added layer of self-awareness. She became more deliberate in her actions, more conscious of how every decision could be perceived. But there was also a sense of quiet strength that had emerged from the ordeal. The fine, once an unexpected disruption, had become a turning point, a reminder that no matter how high one's position, they were still human and subject to the same rules as everyone else. One day, as she was preparing for a committee meeting, a reporter caught up with her in the hallway. "Congresswoman Winters," the reporter said, a hint of a smile on their face. "How do you feel now, looking back on the speeding fine situation? Do you think it helped shape your image in the eyes of your constituents?" Laura paused, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. She answered this question countless times before, but this time it felt different. "I think it was a lesson in accountability," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It reminded me that no one is above the law. Not me, not anyone. I made a mistake and I paid the fine, just like anyone else would. I think it's important to show that we all must take responsibility for our actions, no matter our position. In the end, I believe people respect honesty more than anything else." The reporter nodded, scribbling down her response. Laura couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The fine, which had once felt like a burden, now seemed like a defining moment in her career. It had tested her character, but in the end, it had reinforced her commitment to leading with integrity. Judge Richardson, too, had found a measure of peace, albeit in a more internalized way. The weeks after the incident had left him reflecting deeply on his role as a judge. The criticism from his colleagues had stung, but it had also sparked something within him, a desire to reevaluate the balance between impartiality and empathy. He had always prided himself on being a fair and just judge, but now he recognized that there were times when compassion was just as important as the law itself. In the months that followed, Judge Richardson made a subtle but significant shift in how he approached cases. He continued to uphold the law with the same steadfastness, but he became more mindful of the context surrounding each case. He understood now that the law wasn't just a set of rules, it was a living, breathing thing shaped by the people who came before him. It wasn't just about delivering a verdict, it was about understanding the circumstances, the motivations, and the lives behind the decisions he made. One afternoon, while presiding over a routine case in his courtroom, Judge Richardson found himself reflecting on the decision he had made with Laura Winters. He still believed that he had followed the law to the letter, but now he recognized that it wasn't just about applying the rules, it was about considering the human element. As he issued his ruling that day, he felt a renewed sense of responsibility, a deeper understanding of the weight that came with the robe he wore. Months later, Judge Richardson was invited to speak at a legal conference on judicial reform. The topic was about how judges could balance fairness with compassion, and as he stood before the audience, he couldn't help but think back to his encounter with Laura Winters. He had learned more from that experience than he had realized at the time. In his speech, he acknowledged the importance of impartiality, but also spoke about the need for empathy in the justice system. The law, he said, is not a rigid framework that leaves no room for understanding. It is a tool that must be used with care and compassion. We as judges must recognize that the human experience is complex, and sometimes the fairest decision is one that takes the full context into account. The audience listened intently, and Judge Richardson felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He hadn't fully realized it at the time, but the situation with Laura Winters had changed him, not just as a judge, but as a person. As for Laura, she had grown stronger from the experience. She had faced a public challenge to her character, but it had only made her more committed to her principles. She had always believed in the power of accountability, but now she saw it as something more profound, a reflection of the integrity that should guide her in all aspects of her life. The fine had been a test, but she had passed it by staying true to herself. One quiet evening, as Laura sat in her office preparing for an upcoming vote, she received a letter in the mail. It was from Judge Richardson. In it, he expressed his appreciation for her decision to take responsibility for her actions and how it had influenced his own thinking about justice. "I want you to know," he wrote, "that your example reminded me of what true integrity looks like. It was a lesson I will carry with me in my work moving forward." Laura smiled as she read the letter, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. It had been an unexpected journey, but it had come full circle. The speeding fine had been a small moment in time, but its impact had been profound for both of them. They had learned that justice was not just about the law. It was about understanding, empathy, and doing what was right, no matter the cost. And in the end, that was the lesson that had truly stuck with them both.